Well, welcome everybody. Good evening. My name is Tiger Gutierrez, and I come here as a member of the Center for Psychological Humanities and Ethics Research Group. And we're thrilled to have you here today, both those of you joining us in person and those tuning in virtually. Whether you're sitting in this room or watching from the comfort of your home or elsewhere, we're grateful for your presence. For those seeking continuing education credits, please follow the instructions online or see our staff members at the event. But this lecture is part of the Psychological Humanities lecture series hosted by the Center for Psychological Humanities and Ethics. And we're incredibly grateful for the support that has been made this event possible. So a special thank you to Boston College Philosophy Department for co-sponsoring Claire's visit today and throughout this week, helping her to bring her to campus, as well as the Institute for the Liberal Arts at Boston College for their generous support. We also want to extend our deep appreciation to the John Templeton Foundation, whose generosity continues to foster meaningful interdisciplinary conversations like the one we're about to have today. But now to introduce our speaker. Dr. Claire Katz is Professor of Philosophy and Education at Texas A&M, where she also serves as Associate Provost for Faculty Advocacy. In her very distinguished career, she's been a leading thinker in philosophy, gender studies, Jewish thought, and perhaps most relevant for today's talk, philosophy for pre-college students. Claire is a rare gift for making philosophy accessible to students of all ages, proving that you don't have to be tenured to have a deep philosophical thought. And sometimes you just need to be a curious 4-year-old, or to at least reawaken the curiosity within us with childlike wonder. Her dedication to expanding philosophy's reach led her to establish the Aggie School of Athens, a summer camp where middle and high school students engage in rigorous philosophical inquiry. The program, along with her broader efforts in K-12 philosophy education, has become a national and international model, earning the 2020 APA PDC Prize for Excellence in Innovation in Philosophy Programs. In addition to this and her numerous publications, Claire has received numerous teaching awards, including the Presidential Professor for Teaching Excellence at Texas A&M, the university's highest teaching honor, bestowed in perpetuity, which in academia is maybe about as close as one gets to immortality. But beyond the accolades, what makes Claire truly remarkable is her ability to make philosophy feel alive, not just as an academic discipline, but as a way of engaging with the world. That we don't have to somehow leave behind parts of ourselves to engage in deep philosophical inquiry. I had the privilege of learning from her firsthand as a student, and I can say that her impact goes far beyond what's written in her CV. She's not only a brilliant thinker, but also an incredibly generous thinker and mentor, the kind of person who makes you feel smarter just by being in the room and guides you to ask deeper questions. Her talk today, Awakening Wonder, Introducing Philosophy to Teens and Tweens in Texas, will explore how philosophy can ignite curiosity, create meaningful communities of inquiry, and challenge the idea that philosophy is something reserved for university lecture halls. If you've ever thought, I wish I discovered philosophy earlier, you're about to hear from someone who's dedicated her career to making that wish a reality for young learners across the world. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Claire Katz.
Okay. So thank you very much for that very generous introduction. Very much appreciated. And I should say that that was, when I was here last summer, that was a dynamic experience because it was incredibly, I wouldn't say transformative, but certainly profound for me also to work with such great students in that particular community. So thank you for that. So I want to thank David and Jeff Bleckel, who's the chair of the philosophy department, for inviting me here this week. It's already been a pleasure. We had a lot of fun yesterday. The three of us, I guess it was me, Jeff Bleckel, and one of the grad students in philosophy, did 3 papers on philosophy of childhood, and I don't usually get to do that with other philosophers, so that was actually a lot of fun. And then today attending a colloquium, and then this evening. So I want to just thank you all and the Boston College community for bringing me here, for welcoming me here, and for coming this evening. So my talk is I'm going to just bear with me as we go through this. I have 2 very short videos they're maybe about a minute long, interspersed in the slides. So you'll actually get to hear from our campers and from some of the very young children that we have worked with. Okay, so for those of you that don't have the handout, there's a handout floating around. If you don't have a handout, this is the QR code that will take you to that. So if you prefer to look at it on your phone, it'll be very tiny print, but you're welcome to do that as well. And I just want to start with some thank yous because so this talk is sort of the culmination of 30 years of teaching and teaching kids from as young as 4 all the way through postgraduate. And so I have a lot of people to thank, but just to give you some idea of like these various things where I did my undergraduate work and got started in philosophy, being at Texas A&M, I started my tenure track career at Washington College and then at Penn State. And then in particular, the Cherry Award that's at Baylor was an opportunity for me to develop and to think about something like this. And so this talk is a variation on that. I should go back. That's my family, my immediate family. We're all wearing ski hats and my cats. So for those of you that enjoy pets. Okay. Tom Benson was one of my undergraduate teachers, and he died about 2 years ago. He had a profound influence on me, specifically with regard to the Philosophy for Children program. I'll talk a little bit about my philosophical bio or my academic bio, but Tom was the person who introduced me to the Philosophy for Children program, and this would have been back in the 80s, before the web and before you could look up graduate programs, when flyers were sent out from graduate programs down to various universities. And he quite literally brought the flyer to me and said, "This has your name on it," just because of many of the complaints I was making about how students were learning at the undergraduate level. And so I really owe, in many ways, my going to that program to him. Okay, so I'm going to get started. Philosophy should be in the K-12 schools. A likely statement from a philosophy professor, perhaps, but not words you would expect to hear from a local teenager in South Central Texas. Yet at the end of our 2016 inaugural week-long philosophy summer camp in College Station, Texas, this was one camper's enthusiastic recommendation. And I usually keep a map up here, but I didn't put it up this time. But for those of you that don't know where College Station is, we're at the center of Houston, Dallas, and Austin. So Houston is about an hour and a half south of us. Dallas is about 3 hours north of us. And Austin is about an hour and a half to 2 hours west of us, just to give you some idea of where we are. Using the Philosophy for Children program as our model, I had several pedagogical aims for this first camp: to introduce middle and high school age students to philosophical thinking and dialogue, to develop an intellectual community among the campers, and to provide a space in which young people could partake as equal partners in a series of spirited philosophical discussions. What I did not anticipate within this 1 week time span was the development of intense friendships that would allow these campers to challenge each other in ways that push them to be careful thinkers, responsible ethical decision makers, and generous interlocutors. What I also did not anticipate was that it would be one of the single most transformative experiences, not only for me, but for everyone who participated. As John Dewey reminded us more than 100 years ago in his landmark book, Democracy and Education, the pursuit of truth in a democratic society is best understood as a collaborative endeavor. It cannot and should not be separated or abstracted from the relationships we have with one another. Working with these young people reminded us to pay more attention to the desire for friendship through engaged discussions about meaningful ideas. With few exceptions, these campers began the week barely knowing each other. Throughout the week, they shared their deepest beliefs with each other, and they were challenged by each other to defend those beliefs. By the end of the week, they were trading Instagram and Facebook information to stay in contact. This June, we will host our 10th annual Philosophy Summer Camp. but it was that first one in 2016 that had the greatest impact on us, because what we learned from that experience shaped us in the most profound ways. Our campers left having formed lasting friendships based on the shared experience of philosophical dialogue in its open form, or in its ideal form: open, exploratory, curious, reflective, collaborative, and playful. I left radically transformed, not only by the impact of the dynamic teaching experience, but also by the intellectual and social growth that I observed take place in these campers. And yet here is where I wish to pause and consider what I think contributed to this development. And so here is your roadmap for this evening. My presentation will be in two parts. So a very brief sort of autobiography, a bit about the Philosophy for Children program, a bit about humanities education, and then part two, I'm going to turn specifically to the Philosophy for Children program that I developed at A&M. Okay, so just a brief bio. So I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, and from the time that I was very young, I spent most Friday nights at my grandparents' house, which was just a block away from where I grew up, joining my grandparents at their kitchen table for Sabbath dinner, Friday night dinners. I entered college as a computer science major, but a logic class in my first year started the process of luring me to philosophy. And not many people say that about logic, but it did for me. I loved logic, but it was the courses in ethics, history, and social and political philosophy that provoked me and compelled me to take class after class after class. The interconnectedness of philosophy awakened me to the value and the meaningfulness of the rest of my education. If my courses in English and math and French and science were the bricks that built my education, philosophy functioned as the mortar that connected one brick to the other. Somewhere around the end of my sophomore year of college, I announced to my grandmother, who was generously paying for my college education, that I planned to major in philosophy and go to law school. And so for those of you that know, that's what we all say, right? She took that announcement surprisingly well. But during my junior year, I learned about the master's degree in the Philosophy for Children program. Watching my college peers struggle with that same logic class that I was now tutoring, and observing their difficulty to provide reasoned arguments in philosophy classes, I saw the need to be introduced to philosophy at a younger age. My experience echoed that of Matt Littman, who, along with Anne Margaret Sharp, established the Philosophy for Children program in the early 1970s. And this is actually, I think last year is the 50th anniversary, in fact, of the Philosophy for Children program at Montclair. And so Matt started this when he saw that not only his students at Columbia University, but also the administrators were unable to discuss difficult topics. And at the time, that would have been things like the Vietnam War and the riots that were happening around the Columbia campus, with reasoned arguments rather than emotional pleas. Challenging the prevailing view of children offered not only by 20th century thinkers like Piaget, but also philosophers extending as far back as Plato and Aristotle, Littman concluded not only that children could do philosophy, but also that they must do philosophy. Anne Margaret Sharp's contribution to the development of the Philosophy for Children program, her contributions were numerous, but her signature contribution was the introduction of what we now call the community of inquiry, a pedagogical approach based on the development of an intellectual community with young people as its participants. The community of inquiry would be a safe space to offer ideas, to have ideas challenged, to consider different perspectives, to learn how to reason well, and to be self-reflective and self-corrective about one's own reasoning process. It is a space in which they develop agency and personhood. I'll say a bit more about how the development of the community of inquiry happens, but this approach to teaching was enormously compelling to me. And so I set aside my plans to go to law school and I decided instead to pursue the master's degree in the Philosophy for Children program. News I once again needed to share with my grandmother. And once again, she took the news rather well. Some background might provide some context for my grandmother's incredible support. And so this is actually me in 1984. You can tell probably by the hair. That's the kitchen table. During my time in college, my grandparents lived down the street from where I actually grew up, and then just 20 minutes away from where I was going to college. So during my time in college, I actually returned to that kitchen table for those same Friday night dinners. And each week, my grandmother would ask, "What have you learned in your classes since we last saw you?" We discussed everything from philosophy, history, science, feminist theory, ethics, literature, politics, and social justice. We occasionally disagreed, sometimes vehemently, but she always treated me with respect and listened to my reasons. Our discussions pushed me to be a better thinker. Reflecting on that time, I realized I was drawn to the pedagogy that defines the Philosophy for Children program because of my experience at my grandparents' kitchen table, which was my first experience of a welcoming seminar setting, a practice I have attempted to recreate in all of my teaching. And I should just say my grandfather was a college professor. He was he was trained as a historian of journalism. He had his degree in sociology, but he taught journalism, he taught history of journalism, et cetera, so that whenever that was the three of us at the table, it was quite the experience, and they didn't really let anything go. So it was, I'll just sort of leave that where that is, but in any event. So what I wish to share with you here and now is how the philosophy summer camp for teens and tweens, and we do actually have some tweens, they're younger than 13, that I developed at Texas A&M represents the culmination of my 30 plus years of teaching, which was shaped by this pedagogy. The philosophy summer camp embodies the educational values that are so important to me, from inviting students to a seminar table to teaching others to teach. And it highlights what I think is the best of what a philosophy education can accomplish, not only because philosophy is the content, but also because the specific pedagogical model founded on building a community of inquiry. And I believe that this reveals itself to be indispensable. I'm going to embed my response to why a philosophy summer camp very briefly within a larger discussion of the significance and meaningfulness of a philosophical education for everyone, including and maybe especially those studying in the STEM fields, and then link the impact of this kind of education to the experience of introducing philosophy to young people, specifically through something like a philosophy summer camp. So why is introducing philosophy into the K-12 public school such a challenge? Why is it such a novelty to host a philosophy summer camp? We now have the data that verify what those of us in philosophy have always known anecdotally, that philosophy is a great major for getting high scores on college board exams. We know that studying philosophy improves critical thinking as well as other cognitive abilities. And although often forgotten, especially with so many, where I am, so many different departments and programs that use the word leadership in their title, philosophy and the humanities generally are integral to developing strong leadership qualities. So why is there such resistance to philosophy? One answer, of course, is that many of our philosophical treatises explicitly state that children either cannot or should not be introduced to philosophy. And I talked a little bit about this yesterday with my paper on Rousseau. Most of our schools developed without philosophy as a subject area, and most young people have not had access to philosophy. But that is only one part of the challenge. We can look back through history to as far back as Plato and see that there has never been a time when philosophy enjoyed an unchallenged existence. And so my glib remark is just remember Socrates being invited to drink the hemlock. The suspicion of philosophy's influence on the one hand and the accusation of its uselessness on the other mirrors the two primary attacks on the humanities more generally. To address this challenge about philosophy, I'm going to turn my attention briefly to the humanities. The battle over the soul of education continues, with both assaults fired simultaneously. On the one hand, we see humanities departments shuttered because they cannot compete with their technical counterparts. And on the other, books are banned, course content is controlled, and teachers are silenced. For many disciplines, students might understand that the class is useful, even if difficult. But what many of us face as philosophy professors is not only that students think the material is challenging and for some dangerous or scary, but also, having heard these narratives, they too often think it's useless. Our struggle as humanities professors in the academy is a bit more complicated. Yet why do books need to be banned if the humanities accomplish nothing? This is my favorite slide. Those who believe the humanities are useless betray their fears regarding the dangers of the humanities when they ban books, censor speech, and surveil our classes. I suspect that this image on the slide typically elicits a chuckle precisely because we have strayed significantly from Humboldt's vision of the university that once intentionally housed together the humanities, which ask questions of value, and the sciences, which explore questions of fact, appreciating what each contributed to the other within the pursuit of knowledge. We can consider the recent film about Oppenheimer, in which Oppenheimer and his colleagues are haunted by the moral questions surrounding nuclear weaponry. Those pursuing these projects rarely want to be reminded of the ethical questions, even when these ethical/philosophical questions are raised by the scientists themselves. It is not that humanistic inquiry generally, or that philosophy specifically, is useless, as the critics charge. It is rather that our critics dislike, or indeed fear, what this inquiry accomplishes. But the public is catching on to philosophy's value. I have Mark Cuban up here because he's in Texas. The transformation that occurs in the process of philosophical inquiry, the role of judgment, so for example, the data aren't going to analyze themselves, and the creative mind that develops from philosophical practice are what Mark Cuban has stated cannot be achieved by proxy or AI. Indeed, Cuban declared philosophy the major of the future, precisely because the human judgment of philosophy would resist the radical moves to automation spurred by advances in artificial intelligence, and he said this back in 2018. For example, writing is a creative activity that not only enables us to express what we believe, but also through which we often figure out what those beliefs are. With all the discussions about ChatGPT and the concerns about cheating, we are not asking what is lost when students do not do their own writing. When students do not do their own writing, not to mention their own thinking. A humanities education transforms reluctant consumers into co-creators of their own education. And so one of the things I want to just mention briefly, but I'm not going to do this here, I don't have time to do this here, but for me, what I wound up developing out of this was a first-year seminar at Texas A&M that, because A&M is so large and most of our students don't often have the opportunity of a small class their very first year, in order to provide stronger retention, they developed this first-year seminar program where the course would not have any more than 19 students. It would meet once a week, and the faculty could be creative in what they offered. And so I offered a course that was textual readings of the biblical stories, and the course would have 19 students in it, and that was really all we would do, is just go through these stories line by line, talking about the different modes of interpretation and so forth. And for many of my students, that was the first time that they had ever engaged in a pedagogy that was like that, where they learned to ask questions, where they were challenged by the other students in the class, et cetera. So turning now to the Philosophy for Children program, when I first started the program, I had 3 initiatives, and they were workshops for educators, developing curriculum and doing research, and then K-12 outreach. And again, just to sort of emphasize again, because I'm at A&M, which is a land-grant university, and a land-grant university is a specific kind of public university where we have a very special relationship to the citizens of the state. And so for those of you who have ever listened to Garrison Keillor, and he talks about the extension services and so forth, that's what we do at land-grant universities. But usually that's done by the ag school, where they go out to help farmers, or the engineering program, the engineering college, and often if there's a vet school, where they go out and help people with their cattle, with their with their animals, et cetera. It's unusual for folks in the humanities to find ways to do this kind of outreach. And just to give a shout out to my colleagues in the English department, they did that through a literacy program where they were actually teaching people in the community to read. And so for me, this was an opportunity also to give back to the citizens of Texas by forming essentially an outreach program. Okay, so the introduction of the Philosophy for Children program at A&M presented me with an expanded slate of opportunities for innovative and interdisciplinary teaching. I offered these educator workshops, developed course curricula, and I founded the Philosophy Summer Camp for Teens and Tweens, which we affectionately called the Aggie School of Athens. A&M is the A&M Aggies. So this is Kiri. So as I mentioned previously, in 2016, we started the Philosophy Summer Camp, but then in spring of 2017, I had developed and taught for the first time an undergraduate course on the theory and practice of philosophy for children. Capped at 15 students, the course filled immediately. Of those 15, 5 signed up for the optional lab section that I offered. And during this lab, they would actually go into the K-12 schools and try out what they were learning in class. The lab was optional for 2 reasons. I was unsure how many opportunities I could provide for this particular experience, and I wasn't sure if students would be fearful and not sign up. As it turned out, the students who were afraid to sign up for the lab initially, and I had a bunch who were afraid, expressed regret after hearing about the experiences of those students who participated. They all suggested that I require the lab for successive semesters, feedback that I incorporated into future semesters. And I should just say very quickly here that part of why we came up with the idea of the camp was that I was trying to I felt like my kids were the philosophical version of the cobbler's kids. Both my husband and I are philosophy professors, and so in some sense, philosophy is all over the house, but nowhere intentionally. And so I was trying to get philosophy into some of their classrooms, and the elementary teachers were a little suspicious, and I was having a lot of trouble doing this. And when I reached out to the person who was the vice president for public partnership and outreach, he just thought this was the coolest thing he'd ever seen, and that was sort of small potatoes to just have me go into an individual classroom. And his idea was much broader, that we would develop a center, and that we would do these educator workshops, and we would have a camp. And when he initially said that to me, my image of sort of the camp was khaki shorts and a whistle, and I just thought, I'm not really so sure about this. But then when it became clear that it was going to be difficult to put philosophy into the school classrooms for a variety of reasons that I'd be happy to discuss, it made more sense. I went back sort of, a little embarrassed, but chagrined, and said, okay, I'll give the camp a try. The 5 students who participated in the lab in that first class in 2017 returned the following year to mentor the students who were in the spring 2018 class. And I just thought this was just a neat experience for them to mentor the next round of students. Cora, I wound up, Cora is now a recent law school graduate in 2024. So she actually was part of that first cohort in 2017, and I had partnered with what was then called Launch, which was the undergraduate honors and research program, and they were interested in sort of a pipeline of students who would come out of this experience and then do a year-long thesis. And so Cora actually did do that on democracy and the Philosophy for Children program. And this is just a fun fact about Cora. She used to compete in pageants, and she was actually Miss College Station. And when she competed for the Miss Texas title, she used P4C, Philosophy for Children, as part of her platform. She went on, so not world peace, but Philosophy for Children. She went on to take a master's degree at the London School of Economics, and then she recently did graduate from law school and passed the bar from the University of Texas. In 2017, a colleague of mine and a graduate student also introduced philosophy to 4-year-olds at the Becky Gates Child Care Center, which is connected to A&M. I'm going to show you a short clip. These kids are discussing a book called Du ist Tag, which is a made-up language. And I'm just going to remind you again that you're watching 4-year-olds.
Du ist Tag. A leebeda und plonk. Du kima plonk. Manasud.
Whenever the bird it poked the spider and there's more bugs than there was, and they're saying yay, but it's in a different language.
So you think Sue means yay? Is Tag und Gladenboot? Und Gladenboot.
The flower is dying because it's no water and it needs rain.
This clip is just 60 seconds of a dialogue that continued for close to 30 minutes. So if you have any experience with very young children, you know that in itself is sort of extraordinary. But you can see in the discussion that the children are learning to speculate about what happened in the story and identify patterns in the language to figure out what the words mean. So they're actually learning to identify patterns, to speculate, to give reasons for whatever it is that they're claiming actually happened. In 2017, we launched our own formal study to determine empirically the impact of the philosophy summer camp on teens and tweens. And this QR code will actually take you to the research poster. There have already been numerous studies on the impact of P4C generally on cognitive abilities, improving math, reading, and reasoning skills. For our study, we chose to focus on the social emotional impact of the camp, and our preliminary results, which we published in 2021, demonstrate an increase in intellectual humility, including data that we collected from 21 and 22, and looking at several individual cases, we found an increase in these specific areas: tolerance for ambiguity, authenticity, finding purpose in one's own life, and finding that one matters in life. In 2020 and 2021, I published 2 edited collections on the philosophy summer camp. The contributions included essays written by philosophy camp staff, including my graduate and undergraduate students, but I also included essays by philosophy campers, both middle and high school students, and philosophy camp parents. And I'll occasionally refer to or reference a quote from these campers that was included in these books. So this is the very first planning meeting that we had back in 2016. And so now I'm going to transition to actually talking about the camp itself. So as I mentioned before, we hosted this camp, the very first camp in 2016, and we had 46 campers and a wait list. They were evenly divided between middle and high school students, and also between those who identified as male and who identified as female, approximately 1/3 who would identify as non-white. For those of you who know something about professional philosophy, our camp demographics are significantly different. And this is in professional philosophy, only 17% of professional philosophers identify as female, and approximately 8 to 16%, depending on who's included in that calculation, identify as non-white. Inspired by the mission of the public land-grant university, we offered our camp free of charge to participants, and we've continued that practice for all 9 summers and will continue to do so for the upcoming summer. Our aim is to provide an opportunity for middle and high school students, primarily those in public schools, but not only public school, to be introduced to philosophy through this development of a community of inquiry. The inaugural camp was organized around themes that we thought would be of particular interest to middle and high school students, while also providing a broad view of the discipline. Some of the questions that frame that first camp include the following: what is philosophy? What does it mean to be ethical? What makes a society just or unjust? What is the ideal form of education? And so these are the texts that we drew from that week. Beginning each day with a reading from Plato, we involved the campers in lively discussions about the history of these ideas and their continued importance for contemporary society. The campers connected Plato's questions from 2,500 years ago to difficult and often painful contemporary problems such as police brutality, gender socialization, surveillance, and socioeconomic inequality. On the morning of the first day of the 2016 camp, we introduced Plato's cave allegory, again, a tradition we have continued for all 9 years, and Plato's contention that various epistemic chains prevent most human beings from turning toward the truth. That afternoon, this was the very first day of camp, that afternoon, the middle schoolers contemplated the nature of their own chains within a discussion of gender. The middle schoolers concluded that there were not relevant differences between the sexes. I then innocently asked, "How is this classroom organized?" After a long pause and some glances around the room, the knowing smiles emerged. The campers were clustered throughout the room in groups of boys and groups of girls. "But we're just sitting with our friends," one camper responded, defending the self-segregated arrangement. "Can boys and girls be friends?" another camper asked. "What are we assuming by asking this question?" I queried. "That friendships are not in-love relationships, and that in-love relationships are only between males and females," responded Evelyn, then 11. But that's not true, she continued. "People of the same sex can be in love. So maybe gender differences and our friendships are more complicated than we normally like to admit. Maybe our way of thinking is the problem. Maybe these are our chains," she concluded. Reflecting on that philosophical exchange 4 years later, this same camper wrote the following in her essay for one of the Philosophy Summer Camp books. "I realized then, at that moment, that how we think about our relationships with other people is one of our intellectual chains. Why do we view people in particular ways? Are we trapped in this thinking? What would it take to break those chains? How do we break chains that we do not even know we have? This past year, I started a philosophy club at school so that we could continue these dialogues outside of Philosophy Summer Camp and maybe introduce others to the importance of having these discussions. My friends and I are learning how to leave the cave, and with each other's help, we just might succeed." Just to give you a sense of what we discussed over the course of that first week, at the end of the week, we asked the campers to come up with the question that keeps them up at night. And here is a sampling of those questions, and we had about 50 or 60 of these questions. So when we use the word truth, is it our truth or the truth in general? Will there ever be a just society, and who decides what just is, or just a just society is? Is it possible to have both justice and compassion within a perfect society? What makes art art? Who counts as a philosopher, and how do we define who a philosopher is? In 2018, I initiated a camper advisory board that occasionally met during the academic year for what we called Philosophy Fridays. We discussed ideas for the upcoming philosophy camp, had pizza, and watched and discussed a movie with a philosophical theme, for example, The Matrix or WALL-E. In addition to keeping the community together in between the summer camps, these events provided another opportunity for my undergraduate students to facilitate philosophy discussions. For our December 2019 meeting, one camper suggested that we read one of Plato's dialogues together. And so on a Saturday afternoon, the day after winter break started, from 3 p.m. until well after dinner, a group of middle and high school students, a few former campers who were at the time in college, and another faculty facilitator and I sat around the philosophy department seminar table where we read and discussed Plato's Euthyphro line by line. Responding to this specific afternoon, Calla, who was a ninth grader at the time, wrote the following: "For me, there is nothing more wonderful than the feeling after a thoughtful discussion when your brain is abuzz and almost everything is overflowing and you need to get to a pen and paper as quickly as possible before all your epiphanies float away." And so that's around that table. And for me, it stuns me that their very first day after winter break, this is what they wanted to do. I would enjoy it. It just didn't occur to me that the middle and high school kids would. Although the pandemic forced us into the Zoom world for 2020 and 2021, it also presented us with an opportunity. After noting so this is us over Zoom. After noting their children's excitement every summer, parents would frequently ask us, only partly tongue-in-cheek, when we were going to hold a philosophy summer camp for adults. When the pandemic first hit Texas in spring 2020 and people were feeling isolated before Zoom fatigue set in, we did just that. We ran weekly philosophy discussions for both campers and parents, discussing passages from Camus, The Plague, among other texts. The parents were interested in connecting not only with each other, but also with their kids through philosophical dialogue, expanding our community of inquiry. In response to our discussion of Camus, one parent shared the following with me. "This morning, when I was on the tractor," this is why I love teaching at A&M. He was actually a faculty member at A&M. "I was listening to NPR, and they had a StoryCorps segment between two friends who were both in the healthcare industry. One of them quoted Camus. It was something to the effect that the only way to survive a plague is to be a decent person." And I felt so smart. So philosophy is actually not just for the kids. Zoom offered us another opportunity to experiment. We piloted a summer philosophy program for early elementary-aged kids, which provided us with another occasion to teach our high school students how to facilitate discussions with young people. The surprise for us was that because this program was offered over Zoom, we had people from all over the country, and indeed all over the world, join us. These discussions included 5 6-year-old children from Istanbul, Turkey. And for some reason, philosophy for children is actually quite popular in Turkey. This transformational experience was felt throughout our multi-generational camp, in which faculty, graduate students, undergraduate students, and high school students are co-designers, co-instructors, and co-team leaders. Our faculty facilitators have worked with the camp all 9 summers, and it's the same 4 of us that will be there this summer also. Our graduate and undergraduate student facilitators take these experiences with them into their classes and their future academic endeavors. Our middle school campers move to high school, and our high school campers become facilitators. And you'll see this, you can see this with Caroline, often returning to this role even after they've gone on to college. And indeed, Caroline actually had just sent us an email a week or so ago, she's in college now, that she wanted to come back to camp and actually be a facilitator. So here she's actually facilitating a discussion of Mary Wollstonecraft's The Vindication of the Rights of Women, to a group of middle schoolers. So if you know anything about this text, it's sort of quite extraordinary that she's doing this with a group of middle school kids. Returning to the question I posed at the beginning of my presentation, essentially like why a philosophy summer camp, or how do I think this works? I'd like to share with you the answers that several of our campers give. And I'm going to show you a short clip that has 4 short responses. So Joey, Caroline, Grace, and Matthew. Before sharing the clip, I'm going to provide a bit more context for Joey's response. So Joey attended our his first philosophy summer camp in 2016, just after he'd finished 6th grade. And he attended philosophy summer camp for 7 consecutive summers, including the summer after he graduated from high school. When asked in 2016 why he attended philosophy summer camp, Joey, as if channeling Tocqueville's American ideal of how strangers may come together to form a political community, he responded, "Who would not benefit from deeper discussions of ethics, justice, and education? We need those kinds of discussions," he continued, "to be better friends and to make a better society." Now a junior in college majoring in mechanical engineering, Joey has returned for the past few summers to facilitate philosophy discussions with both middle and high school students. He was also a facilitator with those early elementary kids in that pilot program. And I just want to mention that he's an extraordinarily adept facilitator. And even though he's a junior majoring in mechanical engineering, he's not doing discussions with them on things like philosophy of science. He actually did this close reading of a text and was very interested in helping them think through hermeneutics.
Learning how to think and evaluate new ideas is actually very important in engineering, because you have to take an idea and basically convert it into something physical. And so knowing how to decipher ideas and use that part of the thought process has been very helpful for me.
There's a lot of camps for so many different branches of both STEM and humanities, but philosophy is one that doesn't typically pop up. You can have writing camps. I know I attended a lot of those, but there hasn't been a camp quite like this that's just for philosophical discussion. I think that's a really valuable resource for kids to have.
Philosophy is about stepping back and trying to evaluate yourself and the world around us. I think that it can definitely help me think about what things I need to prioritize, what things I might miss.
Everybody's very positive, and they're like, right when we were making the ground rules, we all established that there's no such thing as bad ideas and everybody's opinion matters. And I think it's just a very positive atmosphere to be here.
In the philosophical discussions that I facilitate, or that I supervise when my students facilitate, I institute a set of rules that are intended to guide the discussion. These include: listen to others, be respectful when responding, wait your turn to speak. They are basic rules, straightforward, although the campers have often added their own rules, like no cell phones. Their simplicity reminds me of the "after you," the phrase that Emmanuel Levinas, the 20th century French philosopher, used to describe how our response to the other, in its most basic form, conditions our everyday life. The "after you" simply means to put the other ahead of me. However, for Levinas, from the standpoint of his ethical project, to put the other ahead of me is everything. I wish to emphasize that when we facilitate these discussions, these rules that guide the discussions are themselves not up for debate. They are what is needed for philosophy to take place. They are not part of philosophy. They precede it. They come before it. My approach to building a community of inquiry is to identify it first as an ethical community of inquiry. By being sensitive to the other, by listening to the other, our campers become better philosophers. In turn, the philosophical dialogue contributes to the multiplicity of perspectives that we all need to become better friends, better citizens, and better thinkers, just as Joey told us. The philosophy summer campers found that the community of inquiry provided them with the space to develop their voice and acquire a vocabulary to use their voice effectively. At a time when political discourse seems to have reached an all-time low, pre-K to 12 philosophy within a community of inquiry is more indispensable now than it has ever been. As Ellie wrote in her essay for the Philosophy Summer Camp book, the most valuable precious jewel I found at Philosophy Summer Camp was the ability to listen to the other side. In survey after survey, our campers explicitly link their experience in the Philosophy Summer Camp to their social and intellectual transformation, and this perspective is often confirmed by their parents. Just as our college students in our philosophy classes often realize, our middle and high school students recognized that the so-called useless philosophical education was in fact the most useful, the most important education of all. It provided them with the foundation to become a better friend, a more engaged citizen, and a more thoughtful member of their community. And so these are just some of the themes, and I'm just going to run through these quickly. So in 2017, we did Philosophical Worlds, and these are some of the texts that we did there. And we actually had a day of Asian philosophy or Chinese philosophy. And in the morning, they did Confucius and Taoism. And in the afternoon, they rotated through Tai Chi, brush painting, and calligraphy. In 2018, we celebrated or honored the 50th anniversary of the publication of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And we did something on literacy and democracy. And there, they're actually making paper. There's the printing. They actually made paper from pulp, and we actually looked at some of the Federalist Papers, and then they actually printed it out on that paper. That's a collage of that. In 2019, this was a philosophy camper-generated theme. We did Harry Potter as the theme, and generated themes that came out of that from identity, magic, epistemology. We invited a magician in, and we had a wand-making activity. And that's the collage from that. And then we were in Zoom on 20 and 2022, 21 and 20 and 2020 and 2021. And then in 22, we used the theme Cultivate Your Garden. And we have a coffee research lab on campus. And Eric Brenner came down and did a fabulous presentation on the ethics of coffee farming. And he talked about how coffee is actually a sustainable crop, and it actually helps to prevent the need for farmers to have to migrate. The lesson I took away as a coffee drinker is to buy expensive coffee because the money actually goes more likely into the farmer's pocket. So then they did a project on sort of who or what is in their garden. And so this is where they are now. These are the campers from 2016. And this is where they are now. Ellie recently graduated from University of Penn Law School. Kenji, who also started in 2016, recently graduated from law school. He was a geosciences major. He stayed a geosciences major, but he picked up the philosophy minor. He's doing environmental law. And then Olivia also started in 2016. She was a year behind them. And she was a year, maybe 2 years behind them. She's now in her second year of graduate school doing molecular biology. But when she went off to college, the philosophy bug took her. So she was a double major in biochemistry and Plan 2 honors. And then these are our middle school campers, a huge cohort that had started in 2016, and people sort of added on to them. But I just mainly wanted to show you the diversity of things that they're majoring in. And so these campers, especially the ones that started in 2016, came for 7 summers. They started in 2016 and they went all the way through until they graduated from high school at the end of 2022. And some of them started a little bit later, 2017, 2018, but they're majoring in business, visualization, some are doing film, mechanical engineering, just so that you can see the range. And so one of the things that really struck me was that I had actually thought that when I started the camp, it would be a way of diversifying the profession, right? That we would attract these young women, we would attract non-white campers, and they would stay and they would go on to, become philosophy majors. And then I realized that the greatest impact might actually be the fact that they are not majoring in philosophy, that they are taking what they've done for all these years and actually influencing and having an impact on the disciplines that they're in, and that they will then go out into the world and have an impact on their professions. And so for me, regardless of the intended major, they all recognize that the importance, not only the importance, but also the joy of awakening their wonder and engaging in philosophical inquiry with others. And so going back to that very first slide, that's what's on that image. We recreate the School of Athens every single summer on the steps of, this is the YMCA building at A&M, that's where the philosophy department is. And so they all have, updated books, there's women in there, although the claim is that in Raphael's version, the women are hidden. I think Hypatia, there's women hidden in it, but our women are not hidden. So you can see here that Ellie and that's Olivia are both holding copies of Beauvoir's The Second Sex. So that's the end of my presentation.
Awesome. Thank you,
I'm
Claire.
happy to take questions. Yep.
So as both virtually and in person, as you all are generating your questions, maybe I would throw a couple questions as people get warmed up. One of the things that I think, that all of your work that really makes me think of is, on one hand, really the formative power or aspect of philosophy and what it asks of us. And, one of the readings I even remember you assigning to us when I was a student that my colleagues will know I continuously keep bringing up is of Matthew Lippman and the P4C, but writing about this moment in which, there's an adult and a child, and the child comes across a rainbow sitting on a puddle, and that this child asks, why is the rainbow on the puddle? And the adult essentially gives some sort of explanation about how oil being on the water and how that will reflect and turn into this rainbow, and how in the end the child essentially just asks again, but what's that got to do with rainbows? And I think about really the way in which so often curiosity or wonder is killed or is put back to sleep at the hands of an explanation. But when I'm hearing all of this and the work that you do is also not just, it's not like these kids or these other people aren't providing some sort of explanation, but maybe it's some way of engaging those explanations or some way of a different kind of engagement with them. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that, this mode of how they're going about encountering explanations, the things that they, ideas, opinions, in the community of inquiry. If you have any thoughts about that.
Are you asking how do the campers talk about this? Is that what you're...
Yeah, I think that in the face of an answer, maybe more so than the question, what you've kind of learned about fostering the wonder in the midst of all these kinds of answers, all these kinds of explanations, and how you see that working in this pedagogy of the community of inquiry.
Right. So that's actually a really good question. So in some ways, I think it drives how we pick the texts that we pick so that they remain open-ended. In some cases, the themes that we pick for the camp are generated by the campers, and we take those pretty seriously. Certainly, whenever we've done the Philosophy Fridays, it's always been, whatever, like we generate a set of films, from the campers, and, somebody picks one. But for the themes for the camp, I think even last year or 2 summers ago, they did animals, plants, machines. And so the idea of, thinking through boundaries and how those boundaries are becoming increasingly porous and blurred. Now when we talk about things like AI, for example, or, self-driving cars or, robots, and people are beginning to think about and fear things like if you watch the film I, Robot or read, the Heinlein or the Asimov books about this, what's going to happen when that line becomes increasingly blurred. And so I think if you start with material that's more open-ended, you're less likely to run into somebody who just shuts down the conversation with a fact, which I think is in some sense what, the example that you gave with, why is the sky blue kind of thing, right? And you can get a very technical answer, but that's not necessarily really where a child is going with that kind of question. But if you stay away from, or maybe not stay away, that isn't really the right way to put it, but for us, and what we also noticed with our campers is that they are increasingly more interested in the kinds of texts that actually are more open-ended. So questions about the best form of government or questions about what friendship is, that naturally stay more open. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe one more question before opening it up. One of the things that came to my mind, this semester I'd been reading Helen Keller's autobiography, The Story of My Life. And in this moment where she talks about her experience in university, she makes this remark that I've been asked to learn so much that I hardly have any time to think.
Mhm.
And that sentiment that I feel from so many of our students, from whether that's in high school or college or beyond, I think you'd really talk about the space to think, and maybe also the affordances of maybe this camp model versus a school. But as you have seen this play out in multitude of ages, what are some of the things that you find as helpful in the recognition of those moments of fostering the thinking, when so often maybe our mode of schooling, our mode of studenting is often to ask what we can learn from it?
So the very first camp that we did in 2016, I had generous funding from what's now called Legacy Liberal Arts. Our former College of Liberal Arts was merged with 2 other colleges into now they're Arts and Sciences. And we weren't sure if we were going to be able to do anything after 2016. So similar to when you're teaching a class and you don't know if students will ever take another philosophy class, and you try to cram as much as you can into that one thing. And we happened to be taking a family vacation out to Hawaii, and I met with some of the folks. This was way back. I met with some of the folks in there's a lovely Philosophy for Children Center at the University of Hawaii, and I had known Tom Jackson for a while, and I met with one of the other staff people there, and he sat down with what we had laid out, and he goes, "Oh, Claire, you're going to have to cut most of this out," because it was like I had built it like a syllabus where we were just going to cram all this stuff in and talk about these things, and I hadn't left that space. I think maybe either a fear that what if we never do this again, et cetera. And so I literally, just took a red pen to most of it and cut out most of it and left these large blocks, where we would do Plato at the very beginning, and then there would be time for, an hour discussion, just on this one, just on the cave allegory, for example. And what was interesting about that is that even having done that, the campers asked us to reduce again and to make more time for discussion. I think we then wound up putting too much time in and, needed to, find some happy medium. And that to me is the difference, at least for me and where I teach, between the philosophy camp and teaching in a college classroom, where I don't have an agenda for the campers. I don't need to worry about, that they need to learn a certain amount of information in order to go to the next philosophy class, for example. It's completely open. It's about developing that community. It's about them learning to trust each other and to question each other. The thing that is for me so heartwarming is not only that those campers came back every year, but that they came back every year knowing what was going to happen at that seminar table. The first time they came, they didn't know they were going to be questioned. They didn't know that they were going to have to defend, whatever they put out there. But every year after that, when they came back, and it was both the students who were male and the students who were female, and that to me was, told us that we were doing something right, that the same campers were coming back knowing that when they spoke, around that table, they were going to be challenged. And that for them, I think, was part of the joy of all of this, was learning from each other, developing that community. And so I think that I even had to learn how to build that time in, because a lot of what I do in the philosophy classroom in a college, I try to build that in there, but I still have to have some kind of accountability. Like if I teach, a philosophy of education class, they have to have read something other than just Plato's Republic. I mean, they read that, but they have to read other things too. Does that, so, I mean, even there, but because I don't have to have the same kind of agenda, I have so much more space to open up that time for them to engage in those kinds of discussions. The thing I would just add, though, is that I would even say that many faculty will say that I don't have time to think. That it's, that the way that even the university has developed and the kinds of things that get loaded onto us, that even as and I think that, I mean, I could go into all kinds of reasons why I think that's happened. But I think that people think thinking is a waste of time, that you're not doing anything when you're thinking. I mean, certainly that's what Thales was accused of. That's what Socrates, I think that this idea that philosophy is useless, I think, comes from the idea that thinking is not the same thing as actually producing something or showing something tangible. So like if you're in your office just thinking, as opposed to grading papers, like I think we're always talking about how busy we are, and that becomes like a badge of honor. So
It sounds like also maybe something happens though when almost like your thoughts are taken seriously. With
certainly
these
for
kids,
them,
yeah.
absolutely, yeah.
Awesome, thank you. Open up.
Thank you so much, Dr. Katz. That was an excellent presentation. Thanks for being here. My name is Madeline. I'm a first-year philosophy PhD student here.
Great.
I just reread Plato's Republic last semester, and on this read-through, a theme that stood out to me was play. A couple of moments in the dialogue where play makes an appearance explicitly, paideia, And there's this moment in book 7 where Socrates actually tells Glaucon, in the context of educating young guardians, don't educate them by force, but play with them. And he says that this will be the most effective sort of pedagogical tool for teaching these students. And it's been like rolling around in my head, this quote, this line, and I've been trying to think, like, what does he mean play? What does play mean in education, and specifically in philosophical education? Like, is this games? Is this like a sort of poking fun at? And I haven't come to a conclusion, and I wanted to pick your mind, like, when you are in this camp setting, when you see your teachers in this camp setting, and you see them being playful with these children, like, what does that look like? Are these games, or like, what does a playful disposition mean to you, I guess, in philosophy education?
One, it's having a sense of humor, but also knowing when and when not to use that, because depending on how laughter works, that can be humiliating for someone, right? So I think, but nonetheless, keeping some kind of sense of humor. Sometimes laughing at the philosophers, in terms of the ideas that they have come up with. Sometimes it's been games. We actually have used, there's a game called the Hobbes game, which is actually, we actually did on the very first, it's in, I think, that journal Teaching Philosophy, in an older issue of that, you can dig it up. And we used that, and we actually did that on the very first day of the very first philosophy camp back in 2016. And that was, fascinating. I mean, because one person who started out as the queen was immediately deposed, and she was out, and it was a way for them to think through how social political philosophy works, or how, what happens when the need to form alliances or to form coalitions, and it got them thinking about various, kinds of how quickly your power can be eliminated. So we actually have used actual games. We did another one, but now I can't remember what it was called. I'd have to dig that up for you. We've done that with logic puzzles, where we've done stuff by teaching logic using different kinds of, logic games and logic puzzles. I'm trying to think of other ways in which we've done play. At the end of every single camp, we've done some kind of creative activity where it's been a skit. They could do a skit, or the year that we did the stuff with the printing presses and literacy, they made zines and talked about political magazines and how that might have worked if they could do a zine now, like if, what would they want to put out, as a zine, some kind of political message, and what has, of course, taken the place of what used to be zines and political magazines. I have the benefit of, on A&M's campus, that we have a special collections library that has actually a collection of 18th century zines that were used. And so it was really great for them to see what these things actually looked like when they were, reproduced and sent out. This last year, they came up with the idea of doing a game show kind of thing, and they had their parents come back. We've always invited the parents in whenever they want to come in, but always on the last day to watch the presentations of the skits, or to look at the collages or the zines or whatever they've done. And in this case, they actually had the parents as the participants. and they had all kinds of philosophical questions, and then they had a group of campers who were doing the judging, for all the different answers. And so usually it's on the last day when they've sort of accumulated some kind of knowledge about, what's taken place the previous 4 days, that they come up with something. The skits that they did during the Harry Potter week were quite hilarious. Where they really, I actually think of sense of humor as depending on the kind of sense of humor on sort of the highest intellectual mode. And so when they can actually take what they've learned and turn it into something funny or witty, I think that that's really a great way of expressing, what they've done. So at the end, does that help you? The last day has always been that space for some kind of more creative, playful, although I will say when they did the calligraphy, that day that we did the Chinese philosophy, we had one camper who was a Marxist, and so he painted, he had a panda, with like the band, and for some reason we had a lot of pandas that were being brush painted that summer. So
thank you so much.
Yeah.
Hello, Dr. Katz. My name's Angelo. We met briefly last night.
Yeah.
When I'm not doing work here or procrastinating on doing work here, I'm working as a K-5 educator who helps out with the special needs students during when I have free time.
Yeah.
And this kind of ties in with Madeline's question about the use of play in educating children. Because speaking experientially, I've definitely seen that when kids are able to engage creatively with the material, they tend to get more out of the lesson. But on the flip side, there's also students and there's also groups of students who need educators to be more of an authority figure who can create a safe and structured environment for them to be creative and playful on their own time, where you're just kind of monitoring them. So what I'm wondering is, how have the philosophy for children sessions been run for those younger students? What has that looked like for them?
Do you mean like for the 4-year-olds, or do you mean for the middle school kids?
For like the 4-year-olds, yeah,
So
that age group.
So the very young kids we don't do in a camp. So the 4-year-olds are like that little clip that you saw, that was at the Becky Gates Child Care Center. And my colleague and the grad student go there, and they're, you could see them, they were set in a circle on the floor, and they read a story, and it's adjusted for age, right? So they read, a picture book, in this case, a picture book that has a made-up language in it. And that was actually the point, because the point was for them to try to figure out what was going on in the story, but completely adjusted for age. But again, normally when you're talking about very young kids, it's unusual for young kids to do anything like that for 30 minutes. I mean, occasionally, you see kids with like an erector set or something, right, where they're just completely engrossed in, building something or putting something together. But you're talking about a philosophy discussion. So I think for them, it was really, how long is this going to go before it begins to deteriorate? And they went for quite some time, and then it was, time to stop. The thing that I know that will often bother me is when a teacher will say, it's fine if they say now is time for philosophy, but when they say now is thinking time, you've already like sort of lost the game, because that's part of like, now we're going to think, and when we're done with that, you don't have to think anymore, right? So that's where it gets, that starts to bother me a little bit when they make that particular distinction. But they have their day to get on with too. So I think after about 30 minutes, it was time, to sort of round that up and stop. But I think that, generally, I'm not sure that they would go for 30 minutes. I think that they would go in and assume that they're there for about 20 minutes, that it might be that they read a couple of pages and then just talk about what's happening in the story for a couple of pages and then, move on to something else. So there's definitely an adjustment for age that absolutely has to be considered. I have a colleague, just give a shout out to him, Michael Burrows, who is, I think he's now at USC. He was at one of the Cal State schools, and then I think he moved to USC. And he did some very interesting work doing ethical discussions with kids, engaging very young kids, 4-year-olds, in discussions about ethics, but where they used art. And so they would draw pictures about whatever it was that they were experiencing or feeling or thinking about, and then have a discussion about that. So there definitely has to be, I think, that adjustment for age. They're not going to sit still for that long. I would even say middle and high school kids, that the philosophy camp, when we started it in 2016, took that break in 2020 and 2021. And then when we returned, we did not return for the full day. When we started in 2016, campers showed up at 8:30 in the morning and were picked up at 4 in the afternoon. So we were not residential, but it was a long day. We had lunch, we had snacks, the whole thing. And there are kids who could not do that. They needed to, it's summer, they needed to be at, soccer camp or tennis camp or swim camp or just, running around outside. So where I would say that philosophy, I do believe, is for everyone. Philosophy camp, maybe not. In the same way that I would say soccer camp isn't for everyone. Like, you might like the soccer unit, when you're in phys ed, but you might not want to go to soccer camp 5 days a week, all day long. Those are very different kinds of experiences. And we did have a situation where we had the second year that we ran the camp. Of course, it's always the second year, because the first year everything went beautifully, which meant we didn't learn anything. We had no idea why it went so well. But the second year, we did have a bunch of campers who, they really couldn't be there all day. Like, they just couldn't, and they started to act out, and they misbehave, in the sense of misbehaving meaning it was not appropriate behavior for being inside a seminar room, in the philosophy department. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think that issue of and I wouldn't say they needed an authority figure. They just couldn't sit all day discussing philosophy, and I don't blame them. That's not for them. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Hi. This is great. Thanks. So I know the work of Matthew Liebman for a long time. When we were designing our own robotics summer camps, we looked at the philosophy summer camp for a long time. But I have a question on what's the mindset? So a lot of the discussions you were, the methodology of teaching reminds me of when I went to Jewish camp, right? It wasn't anything, I didn't hear anything different except the text you were reading, right? But there is something different, I imagine, about the field of philosophy that's unique about a mindset that a philosopher wants to have in their kids, right? We have a mindset. We want kids to be asking certain kinds of questions or thinking this way. There's a philosophical mindset as opposed to just a thoughtful conversation where these things can happen. So could you just, what are those philosophical ways of doing things? Because if you had to scale this, right, and it's not just you, and you had to train trainers, right, how would you coach those? Which are philosophical ways of thinking? Could you just name them? Which would be, I know it sounds to structure. Those of you who know me, I don't like structure, but in this case, I feel like I need to have that structure in order to be able to distinguish this. What makes this philosophy camp separate from my youth camp, the Jewish camp? Right.
So I would actually say, though, depending on what you were doing at the Jewish youth camp, it may have been very philosophically oriented. A lot of, like when I mentioned that very briefly, doing that first year seminar, I was actually doing things like midrash, with these students and helping them formulate philosophical questions that would emerge out of the text. But what I would say is, I think that that's actually the most difficult part of doing something like a philosophy summer camp, is teaching campers how to ask a philosophical question, because that is not something that they are taught to do. At least, when I think about public school, I have to adjust for, I don't know how many of the students who come to Boston College come out of a Catholic school, K-12 school, where they actually have had some kind of Jesuit education, which my husband actually had, where they are actually learning those kinds of things in K-12. Most students are not. And when I taught this class, even at the undergraduate level, the thing that I noticed when I was doing the philosophy for children, this actually speaks to Tyga's question about time, when I taught this undergraduate class in philosophy for children, I would actually say that, interestingly enough, that class which was very pedagogically based and methodologically based in terms of teaching these students the theory and practice of philosophy for children, and where I was very intentional about doing P4C with them in the classroom, those are my students who became the best philosophers by the end of the class, because the entire class was based on teaching them how to ask the philosophical question, and then how to ask that question of their classmates when they were posing a question or, you know, making a claim, asking them to give reasons, asking them for evidence, asking them to incorporate the counterexample into, or a different perspective into the position that they had. So what I would say about philosophy is that it's two pieces. It's the kind of question that you ask, like whether it's an epistemological question or an ethics question or an existential question, but it's also the way in which you approach that particular discussion. Somebody can ask a question and then you just give some kind of factual answer, or you can entertain it in a different kind of way, right? With speculation, or what happens if you consider this perspective, where you try to move the dialogue forward. And so the way that I know that Matt Littman would occasionally talk about a philosophy discussion is that it's like a boat moving, and it might tack back and forth, but its trajectory is to move forward. And I think that's what that tends to happen in a philosophical discussion, where you might wind up going down this road and it turns into some kind of blind alley and you have to come back. The aim is to move the discussion forward. But the kinds of questions, what I love about philosophy is that the world is open. I mean, it's everything from questions about the environment to what makes us human, to ethical questions, to what's the best form of government, to that very first summer we did ethics, politics, education. So it was, you know, what kind of person do I want to be, or should I be? What kind of government, what's the best form of government? What kind of educational system will deliver, you know, these things? You know, how do we think about these things, you know, connected to each other? And so the philosophical question you can do with almost any topic. I mean, Harry Potter, which some people would say, yeah, the British version, of course, was Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, right? That was the title that's in Britain. So it's already embedded in that. But they had no idea that something like magic, when we brought the magician in, the idea that magic could be a form of epistemology or a form of knowledge was fascinating to these campers. It had never occurred to them that when you say you do magic or you know a trick, that it's a form of knowledge, and even just saying it is already revealing something, right? That you know how to do something that somebody else doesn't know, you know, the truth to, or something along those lines. So I'm not sure if I'm completely getting at your question, but I'm not sure that there's a trick or a thing to teaching the philosophical question as much as it's modeling how to engage a philosophical, you know, how a philosophical question emerges. And some of that's by reading the text and the facilitators asking questions. And some of it is helping them to think about, one of the things we usually have to do is help them distinguish, so apologies to the psychology people in the room, the difference between a psychological question and a philosophical question. So why did someone do something often is taking the form of a psychological question. They're looking at motivation, as opposed to why did somebody do X, which may have more to do with a causal situation. Does that help?
Claire, thank you so much. I want to take you back to the moment where you were talking about how, somewhat surprisingly, not that many of the philosophy camp graduates were choosing to major in philosophy. And I wanted to ask you, a quick three-part question, but I swear they're each short and they're linked.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Question one, what's your theory about why that is? Question two, can we agree that a class in literature that's genuinely using community of inquiry deserves the label of philosophy more than a class where some guy's mumbling off of his notes about the difference between Heidegger and Husserl or something like that? And the third question is, what do you think of Thoreau's comment that there are nowadays no philosophers, only professors of philosophy?
Okay, so the first part, we did actually have philosophy majors. So Ellie the very first Ellie, I had two Ellies. So the very first Ellie, she came to us as she was a rising senior in high school, and she came from a very science family. Her mother was an engineering professor, dean, et cetera. And she, said that she was going to major in biology, and we just didn't think much about that. That's great. But it turns out that after that week of philosophy summer camp, she went off to UT and she majored in sociology and minored in philosophy, and then went off to law school. And her mother actually told me, like in front of other people, that she attributed that to the philosophy camp. And then similarly, Kenji, who was the geosciences major, had no intention of picking up philosophy. He wound up wandering into the philosophy for children class, just auditing it because he knew who I was. And he did all the work. He hadn't registered for the class, and then the next time I offered it, he actually signed up for the class and did all the work for the class. And then he just kept taking more and more philosophy classes. But geosciences was his thing. He was really interested in the environment, and so he wound up also minoring in philosophy and then going off to law school to do environmental law. And then Olivia did, she was a STEM, knew from the time she was 5 that she was going to do biology, and she wound up majoring in biochem, but went to UT and did a second major in, if you know anything about Plan 2 honors, it's a structured arts and sciences honors program where you do a year of world lit, which when I looked at her reading list, they were doing everything from Plato to Spivak, and all the philosophy, embedded in there. A year of philosophy, a year of epistemology or logic. So it's a very heavy humanities, philosophy-oriented honors program. And I think all three would say that they sort of were awakened in some way by the philosophy camp and how important that is. And I know that Olivia specifically would say how important the humanities and specifically philosophy is to the work that she's doing in molecular biology, that thinking about these ethical questions and thinking about what kind of research, what research means in the larger world. With the middle school kids, Evie did go off, and that's actually my younger daughter. She actually is she's a double major in Plan 2 honors and philosophy. And then the other ones, I think that it was, many of them were going to be in the liberal arts and didn't think they needed to major. Their passion was, one is doing urban planning and one is doing psychology. One, I think, was sort of, the business major is more of a family profession. Both of his parents were, or are they're professors in the business school. And there were a couple of others, Joey, similarly, mechanical engineering. So I think that for them, I think that philosophy was important, but not necessarily what they wanted to make a career out of. And that's fine. I don't know that I have an explanation beyond, they're all different, right? I'm glad that many of them chose to stay with whatever it was that was their passion, but then they still came back to philosophy camp every year. So there's that piece. And then, yes, I would absolutely say that there are ways of being philosophical and ways of engaging in a community of inquiry. We use literature too around the seminar table, and certainly I would say that about many of my colleagues, absolutely, who teach in the English department. What I would say is it's how you teach whatever that material is. There's some pieces of literature that are quite philosophical, but those philosophical themes are not brought out by the instructor, right? And then you have the flip side where you have people who are teaching philosophical texts, but as you said, simply lecturing as if this is just material to absorb as opposed to teaching their students how to become philosophical. And that's a very different mode, similar to the question that I think Marina was asking. And then the last piece, I'm not sure Thoreau is right. I do think that it is increasingly difficult for people to write their own thing. And I think especially people in the US, scholars in the US always feel like there have to be a million, footnotes, and they have to name check a million philosophers. And it's more about writing about somebody else's text. I think that's true. I think public philosophy is becoming a space where, in public humanities, where the philosopher is emerging, but I think it's also scary to do that given the political climate. that we're in. I think people are afraid to put out their own position, and just it can be great because you reach a wider audience, but it can also be terrifying because you reach a wider audience. It's an interesting question. I've often thought about that generally, that people seem so tied to somebody else's text that they're not putting forward their own ideas, and that there's something about the way in which the American university system has developed with the sort of publish or perish, and everything has to be peer reviewed. And how do you peer review something that doesn't have the million footnotes in it, right? Because that's what we talk about in terms of scholarship. So, yeah. What do you think? What do you think of Thoreau's?
Oh, I think it's overstated, but a helpful corrective. And
Mm-hmm.
it's brand new what you're describing, right? Emerson, American scholar, self-reliance. He's stressing the way that you teach people instead of trying to rival a Shakespeare or a Plato to comment on them.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a rich discussion, and I know there's more questions, but as we close, I just want to thank all of you for being here and our sponsors, but most of all, please help me in thanking Dr. Claire Katz.
Thank you.